The disturbing wedding night ritual Rome tried to erase from history. Picture a quiet morning in a busy Roman neighborhood, the kind where shopkeepers lift their shutters and the first voices echo off stone walls, signaling the start of a day that will end in a ritual most of us would find terrifying. It is a wedding day, but not the kind we imagine with choice, romance, and privacy. For in ancient Rome, the union of two souls was less about love and more about a transaction sealed in the presence of the gods. The bride is very young by modern standards, perhaps only 12 or 13, promised long before she truly understood what marriage meant. And today the promise becomes public fact. Before sunrise, her mother wakes her and brings out an object that feels startling. In a domestic room, a spear, the hasta caeliberis, its iron tip cold and unyielding against the warmth of the morning. Not a decorative prop, but a real weapon associated with war and authority. Perhaps even one that had been plucked from the body of a fallen gladiator to ensure fertility. With careful hands, her mother begins to part her hair section by section using the spear's tip, working slowly enough to avoid a cut, repeating advice that has passed from one generation to the next. Stay calm, do not fight the ritual, do what is expected. Welcome to Medieval Spirits, where we dig up the bones of the past to see how they lived, loved, and died. If you like clear, story-driven history that follows real customs and real sources, consider liking this video and subscribing to join our legion of history lovers. Today we are stepping into a Roman wedding not to sensationalize it, but to understand it, because the most unsettling part is not that these practices were hidden in some dark dungeon. They were public, traditional, and treated as meaningful, celebrated with flowers and songs, even as they enforced a rigid hierarchy. Rome did not need secret rooms for its power to show itself. It wore its authority like a toga, wrapped in the folds of tradition. It displayed power in daylight, inside family ceremonies, with neighbors watching and approving, because that is how a society teaches everyone what is normal. And here is the twist that challenges everything you thought you knew about ancient romance. You may have heard the famous tale of the first night, right? Or droit du seigneur, where a lord claims a bride before her husband, a story that has haunted the medieval imagination for centuries. In the Roman world, that specific idea is almost certainly not supported by solid evidence, serving more as a later myth to demonize the past. Modern historians have searched for laws and reliable contemporary accounts and come up empty, finding instead a system of legal contracts rather than feudal abuse. But that does not mean Roman wedding customs were gentle by our standards. In fact, their lawful nature makes them even more chilling. The reality was different, and in some ways more revealing of the deep-seated control exerted over women. It was not one villain breaking the rules in a burst of passion. It was families, priests, and communities following the rules exactly as tradition described them, using ceremony to mark a transfer of authority over a woman's life. To understand why a spear appears in a hairstyle, scratching at the scalp of a frightened girl, we have to understand what Roman marriage was designed to do. In the most traditional model, marriage was not primarily a private bond between two equal adults seeking companionship. It was a public arrangement connecting households, property, and future children, a merger of corporate interests rather than a union of hearts. Roman law and custom were built around the authority of the paterfamilias, the male head of household, whose power over his family's legal life was enormous, extending even to life and death in the earliest days. A daughter could be loved, educated, and respected, fed the finest foods, and dressed in silk, but she was still expected to move from her father's authority into her husband's household like a piece of movable wealth. Even as the legal details changed over the centuries, the theater of the wedding continued to express the older message. The bride is being moved, and the community is here to witness it. The spear ritual has a name in later descriptions, the hosta used for the bride's hair parting, creating a style associated with sacred tradition known as the tutulus. Ancient writers like Plutarch discussed possible meanings and even admitted Romans argued about it, proving that even they were sometimes puzzled by their own violent symbolism. Some interpretations are straightforward, a nod to Mars, the god of war, or a hope for strong sons who would defend family and state with the same iron resolve. Other interpretations are darker in implication, not because they describe constant violence, but because they connect marriage symbolism to conquest, equating a wife with a captured city. The spear is not a soft tool, it is an emblem of force, designed to pierce and kill. When a culture chooses that emblem to touch a bride first, before her husband's hand, it is telling a story about what marriage represents. That story reaches back to one of Rome's founding legends, the so-called abduction of the Sabine women, a tale of mass kidnapping that underpinned Roman society. The myth, repeated in art and literature, describes early Rome as a city of rough men, without enough women to form families and sustain their population. A festival is held. Guests arrive in good faith, and then the women are seized and taken as wives against their will in a coordinated ambush. In the myth, the women later intervene to stop a war between their birth families and their new Roman households, becoming symbols of reconciliation and the stabilizing force of the state. Romans did not treat this as a shameful secret to be buried. They treated it as an origin story, and they echoed it in wedding ritual, reenacting the capture every time a girl left her father's house. The message was not subtle. Marriage is a kind of capture transformed into legitimacy. Now we need to slow down and talk about something that sounds dry, but explains almost everything, the legal framework behind family life that acted as the invisible cage for Roman women. In earlier Roman tradition, the most prestigious form of marriage was often described as cum manu, or entering the hand, meaning the bride's legal position shifted entirely into her husband's household authority. Under that model, her property and legal standing became tightly bound to his family line, severing her legal ties to her own father. In practical terms, it meant that marriage was not only personal, it was structural, reshaping the very architecture of Roman society. It reorganized inheritance, religious duties, and the social map of alliances, ensuring that wealth and power flowed through male lines. A wedding was a public announcement that a woman's identity was now anchored to a different household, her old self effectively erased in the eyes of the law. Over time, especially in the late Republic and Empire, another form of marriage became common among elites, often described as sine manu, or without the hand. In those arrangements, a woman might remain legally connected to her birth family and could hold property with more independence, especially if her father had died and she had a favorable legal position. Elite Roman women could be influential, wealthy, and socially powerful, funding temples and influencing elections from behind the scenes. And the sources show they sometimes managed estates and networks with real skill. But here is the key point for our story. Even when legal reality became more flexible, wedding ritual often stayed conservative, clinging to the symbols of the past. The ceremony continued to speak the language of transfer, obedience, and household control. Because ritual is not just about law, it is about cultural memory. Ritual is about teaching expectations. That brings us to consent. A word that sounds simple and modern but becomes complicated when you place it inside an ancient social structure built on duty. Roman law recognized certain formal requirements for consent, but a girl raised from childhood to understand that her father arranged alliances and that her future depended on family decisions had limited, meaningful choice. A bride would recite a traditional formula that sounded like partnership. Where you are, Gaius. I am Gaia. A promise to share a household and a life. Yet in practice, the words reinforced the direction of movement she follows into his world, adopting his name and his gods, not the other way around. The community's presence made the decision feel final, a current of social pressure that no individual could swim against. Once the ritual began, it carried her forward like a current toward a destiny she had little power to alter. The next symbol was physical and memorable, the bridal belt and its famous knot, the nodus Herculeus, sometimes associated with the strength of Hercules. It was presented as a sign of purity and readiness for marriage, tied in a way that was intentionally difficult to untie, requiring patience and dexterity. In modern retellings, this is sometimes turned into a playful detail, a mere fashion choice of the ancients. But in Roman symbolism, it also functioned as a boundary marker. It announced that the bride's status was changing, locking her chastity away until the proper moment. And it framed the wedding night as a socially important moment, not a private discovery between two equals. The knot was not merely clothing, it was a seal on a contract. It was a public sign that the household expected the marriage to be completed, and that the husband alone possessed the key. As afternoon moved toward evening, the wedding became louder and more theatrical, shedding the solemnity of the morning sacrifice. The procession from the bride's home to the groom's home was not a quiet walk down a garden path. It was a street performance, filled with torches that smoked in the twilight, music from flutes and lyres, friends, relatives, and curious onlookers pulled in by noise and tradition. Roman writers described joking, teasing chants called fascinin verses that were deliberately crude, sexually explicit, and supposedly meant to ward off bad luck with humor and shock. Whatever the official explanation, imagine the emotional effect on a young bride hearing strangers shout graphic jokes about her body and her wedding night as she walked through the streets. Even if adults told her it was just ritual, it was still a crowd turning her most private transition into public entertainment. The most famous moment of this procession is one we still recognize today, though we have softened its meaning into a romantic gesture. The groom carrying the bride over the threshold. Romans worried about omens, and stumbling at the doorway was considered incredibly unlucky, a sign that the gods rejected the union. So the bride was lifted and brought in, sometimes kicking and screaming in a mock show of reluctance to leave her father's house. In modern weddings, This is framed as romance, a gallant act of strength. In Roman symbolism, it also reinforced something else. She does not enter entirely on her own terms. She is taken. She is brought into the household as a possession is brought in. The door closes. The crowd stays outside, and the chants continue, muffled by the heavy wood. Even if the house becomes quieter, the bride knows the entire community, expects what comes next inside a Roman home. The central hall, or atrium, was not merely a hallway for passing through. It was a semi-public space where clients might be received, family business discussed, and household life displayed for all to see. In many descriptions, the marriage bed, the lectus genialis, was positioned here as a statement, not hidden away in a private bedroom like a secret. It functioned as a symbol of legitimacy and continuity, placed opposite the door so no visitor could miss it. Because Roman society cared intensely about heirs, household lineage, and clear family status, the bed announced that this household was properly formed and that future children would have a recognized place in the family line, distinct from illegitimate offspring. That is the part Rome celebrated: continuity, stability, and social order over individual desire. A married matron, the pronuba, ideally a woman who embodied the community's ideal of marital respectability by having been married only once, sometimes guided parts of the ritual and brought the bride to the bed. The presence of such a figure was meant to bless the transition and to reassure everyone that the ceremony was being done correctly, adding a layer of maternal authority to the proceedings. Different sources disagree about how much privacy couples had at the final moment, suggesting a spectrum of practices. Customs varied across centuries, regions, and family types, from the strict republic to the decadent empire. Sometimes the household withdrew to the shadows. Sometimes a few trusted attendants lingered nearby to ensure no bad omens occurred. But whether anyone was physically in the room or not, the couple was surrounded by expectation. The wedding night was not framed primarily as a private choice or a moment of love. It was framed as a duty to the state. This is where we should speak carefully and honestly, stripping away the varnish of history. Ancient Roman law and culture did not include the modern concept of ongoing, freely given sexual consent within marriage. The way we discuss it today, the husband's sexual access was typically assumed as part of marriage, a right granted by the ceremony itself, and the wife's ability to refuse was not protected as an independent right in the way modern legal systems now recognize. That does not mean every marriage was identical or that every husband was a monster. Humanity always breaks through the cracks of rigid systems. People are people, and relationships vary, with real affection growing in many unions. But the system itself leaned heavily toward male authority, giving the husband the legal upper hand. And when the bride was very young and the groom much older, the imbalance was built in by design. The ritual did not exist to protect her comfort. It existed to confirm the household contract. The next morning, the marriage was expected to be socially verified in ways that can feel intrusive and clinical to modern ears. Some accounts suggest families looked for proof of virginity or the completion of the union, such as stained linens, sometimes privately, sometimes in a way that blurred the line between private life and public reputation. Virginity mattered because it was tied to certainty of lineage, and lineage was tied to inheritance and political stability. A man needed to know his son was his own. Rome, like many ancient societies, treated a woman's sexual history as a form of family property, something that affected status and alliances and could be damaged like goods. The bride's body became a site where family honor was measured, scrutinized by matrons, and gossiped about by slaves. That is not a comfortable truth. But it is an important one for understanding why these rituals were performed with such seriousness. At this point, you might ask if these customs were so open and so central. Why do many people today know the myths more than the real rituals? The answer is not that Rome tried to hide everything in a conspiracy of silence. The change happened slowly, shaped by cultural evolution, religious transformation, and the way later societies chose to admire Rome. When Christianity rose in influence and later became dominant in the empire, wedding practices gradually shifted, absorbing and altering pagan customs. New values were emphasized publicly, at least in language and ceremony, and certain older pagan symbols like the phallic fascinus became less fashionable or were reinterpreted. But traditions do not vanish overnight. They are stubborn things. They fade, transform, and reappear in different forms, hiding in plain sight. Then came a second, quieter transformation memory, the filter through which we view the past. From the Renaissance onward, Europe built an idealized Rome in its imagination, a city of white marble and noble philosophers. Rome became the model of law, architecture, and civic power for rising nation-states. People copied Roman columns and quoted Roman writers, and they wanted Rome to look like the polished ancestor of their own civilized world, stripped of its brutality. In that process, uncomfortable details were often minimized or ignored to maintain the fantasy. The public loves aqueducts and Senate speeches. They represent order and progress. It is less eager to dwell on the daily realities of gender hierarchy inside homes, where the order was maintained by dominance. So the spear becomes a curiosity rather than a warning, and the mock abduction becomes romantic tradition rather than a symbol of control. Modern media continued that trend, polishing the marble until it shone with a false light. Films and television often portray Roman marriages with modern emotional assumptions, as if they functioned like contemporary relationships with contemporary rights, showing couples marrying for love against the odds. Even academic history, for a long time, focused on politics, generals, and public institutions, subjects dominated by elite men in the sources who rarely wrote about the interior lives of their wives. The household sphere, where women's lives were structured and constrained, was treated as less important, a backdrop to the real history of wars and laws. Only in more recent decades has scholarship paid sustained attention to women's legal status, daily experience, and the way ritual shaped their sense of self. Historians and classicists have drawn on letters, legal texts, inscriptions, medical writing, and archaeology to reconstruct what normal life looked like for people, the old narratives treated as background. And what emerges is not a cartoon of constant cruelty, which would be easy to dismiss. It is something more realistic and, in a way, more challenging, a society that could produce breathtaking art and careful law while still building family life on deep inequality. Roman women could be admired, educated, witty, and influential. running businesses, and advising emperors, yet still be constrained by a system that defined their bodies and choices through male authority. Marriage rituals were not random parties. They were a curriculum, a lesson plan for social order. They taught a bride, her groom, and the entire community what roles were expected, what power looked like, and what boundaries were not meant to be crossed. When people say it was just tradition, what they often mean is the system felt normal because everyone grew up inside it, inhaling its values like the air they breathed. This matters today not because we want to feel superior to people from 2,000 years ago, judging them from our high horse. It matters because these ideas did not vanish the moment Rome fell. They seeped into the groundwater of Western culture. Legal and cultural assumptions about a wife's duties and a husband's authority echoed through later European history for centuries, influencing laws well into the modern era. Many modern wedding customs still carry faint shadows of older symbolism, the public transfer of the bride from father to groom, the emphasis on white for purity, the idea of being given away, the pressure to perform a certain kind of femininity for the sake of family reputation. We have changed a great deal, and that change matters immensely. But understanding the origins of symbolism helps us see what we have inherited without noticing. Like an old heirloom we display without knowing its original purpose. So, what was the ritual Rome tried to erase? The best answer is that Rome did not erase it. Later, admirers did, sanitizing the past to make it palatable. Over time, we filtered Rome into what we wanted it to be, an ancestor of modern civilization without the parts that challenge our pride. We kept the marble statues and forgot the household power dynamics that sustained the men who built them. We repeated grand stories of republic and empire and left quieter stories in the corner, especially the stories of girls whose lives were decided early and celebrated publicly as order. The spear in the hair, the noisy procession, the carried threshold, the symbolic knot, the semi-public marriage bed, all of it formed a single message. Marriage is not merely love. It is structure, and structure is enforced by culture. If there is a lesson here, it is not that the past was evil and the present is perfect. It is that systems can feel sacred when everyone benefits from believing they are sacred. Rituals can make inequality feel natural, wrapping chains in flowers until they feel like ornaments. And because rituals feel beautiful, filled with music and nostalgia, they can hide what they are teaching us about power. When you look at these Roman wedding customs closely, you are not just looking at an old ceremony from a dead civilization. You are looking at a society explaining itself, using symbols instead of speeches, making power look like tradition so that no one questions it. Thanks for watching, Medieval Spirits. If this episode made you see Roman history with clearer eyes, peeling away the romance to see the reality, tell me in the comments, what other romantic historical customs do you think deserve a closer, more honest look? And if you want more stories like this, where we follow the sources and unpack what they really meant for ordinary people, like subscribe and ring the notification bell. Next time, we can explore another Roman institution that looks elegant from a distance, but becomes far more complicated up close. Until then, remember that history is not just what is written in stone, but what is whispered in the rituals of the everyday